In March 2022, a quiet home in the mountains of Utah became the center of a mystery that would eventually shock the entire country. At first, the story appeared to be a tragedy. A husband had suddenly died in the middle of the night, leaving behind a grieving wife and 3 young children. Friends and neighbors described the family as successful, active, and deeply involved in their community. But within a year, the story would transform from a heartbreaking loss into one of the most disturbing criminal cases in recent American history. At the center of the case was a woman named Kouri Richins. Kouri Richins lived with her husband, Eric Richins, and their 3 children in a growing community near the mountains of northern Utah. From the outside, their life appeared comfortable and stable. Eric worked as a successful contractor and builder. He had built a strong reputation in the local construction industry and was known as a hardworking businessman. Kouri, meanwhile, was an entrepreneur who had become involved in real estate and property development. Together, they seemed to have built a successful life. They owned property, were raising a young family, and were known by many people in their community. But behind that image, the marriage between Kouri and Eric had reportedly become complicated. According to investigators, the couple had begun experiencing serious financial disagreements in the months before Eric's death. Prosecutors would later reveal that Eric had recently discovered troubling financial decisions made by his wife. Records suggested that Kouri had taken out loans and made real estate purchases without Eric's knowledge. Some of those financial moves had placed the family under significant pressure. Friends later said Eric had started questioning some of the financial deals connected to his wife. But no one could have predicted what would happen next. On the night of March 4, 2022, Eric Richins went to bed inside the family home. According to reports later shared in court, the couple had spent the evening together. Kouri told investigators that she had prepared a drink for her husband before bed. Shortly afterward, Eric went to sleep. But during the early hours of the morning, something went terribly wrong. According to Kouri's account, she woke up and discovered that Eric was unresponsive. Emergency services were called. But when paramedics arrived, it was already too late. Eric Richins had died. At first, the death did not immediately raise suspicion. The family and friends who heard the news believed it had been a tragic but natural loss. Eric was only in his 30s, but sudden deaths can sometimes happen without warning. For a time, the situation appeared to be exactly that, a devastating tragedy for a young family. But investigators soon began noticing details that did not seem to fit. During the initial examination, medical officials became concerned about the possible cause of death. A toxicology report was ordered. The results would reveal something shocking. Eric Richins had not died from natural causes. Instead, the toxicology test showed extremely high levels of fentanyl in his system. Fentanyl is a powerful synthetic opioid that can be deadly even in very small amounts. The concentration found in Eric's body was far beyond what could occur accidentally. To investigators, this discovery raised an immediate and disturbing question. How had fentanyl entered Eric Richins' body? Detectives soon began examining the circumstances surrounding the night of his death. They reviewed the timeline of events inside the house. They spoke with friends, relatives, and co-workers. They examined financial records and phone data. Slowly, the investigation began uncovering a story that was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Meanwhile, in the months after Eric's death, Kouri Richins appeared publicly as a grieving widow. She spoke about the difficulty of raising 3 children after losing their father. Then she made an unexpected decision. Kouri announced that she had written a children's book. The book was designed to help children cope with the loss of a parent. It was titled Are You With Me? The story followed a child who was learning how to deal with the death of a father. Kouri promoted the book during interviews and public appearances. In those interviews, she described the emotional pain of losing her husband and the challenges her family faced after his death. For many people watching the story unfold, the situation seemed heartbreaking. A mother who had lost her husband was trying to help other families facing similar grief. But investigators working on the case were continuing to examine the evidence. And what they discovered in the months following Eric Richins' death would completely change how the public viewed the story. Because behind the image of a grieving widow and children's author, detectives were beginning to uncover clues that suggested something far darker had happened inside that Utah home. Clues that pointed to a possible plan involving money, secrets, and a deadly dose of fentanyl. And soon, the investigation would focus on the one person who had been closest to Eric on the night he died. His wife. After the toxicology report revealed that Eric Richins had died with an extremely high level of fentanyl in his body, investigators in Utah realized they were no longer dealing with a natural death. Instead, they were facing the possibility of a murder investigation. Fentanyl is a powerful synthetic opioid that is often used medically to treat severe pain. But in uncontrolled amounts, the drug can be deadly. The level discovered in Eric's system was far beyond anything that could have happened accidentally. To detectives, the next question was clear. Where had the fentanyl come from? And how had it entered Eric's body? Investigators began reconstructing the final hours of Eric Richins' life. According to statements later shared in court, his wife, Kouri Richins, had told police that she and Eric spent the evening together at home. She explained that she had prepared a drink for him before they went to bed. Later that night, she claimed she woke up and discovered he was unresponsive. But as detectives examined the evidence, several details began raising questions. One of the first concerns involved the timeline. Investigators noticed inconsistencies between Kouri's statements and the physical evidence from the house. They also began reviewing financial records connected to the couple. What they discovered revealed serious tension inside the marriage. According to prosecutors, Eric had recently learned that his wife had taken out large loans without telling him. Some of those loans were connected to real estate investments. Investigators later found that Kouri had purchased multiple properties using borrowed money. In some cases, the deals had been made without Eric's knowledge. When Eric discovered the financial transactions, the situation reportedly created major conflict between the couple. Friends later told investigators that Eric had started questioning many of the decisions related to the properties. He was also reportedly considering changing parts of his financial plans. For detectives, this information suggested a possible motive. If Eric had been planning to limit his wife's financial access or challenge her business decisions, it could have created serious tension inside the marriage. But investigators soon uncovered even more troubling information. As part of their investigation, detectives reviewed text messages and phone records connected to Kouri. Those records revealed conversations with a person who investigators believed had been involved in supplying drugs. According to prosecutors, Kouri had allegedly asked this contact about obtaining fentanyl. The messages raised serious suspicion. Investigators now believed the drug that killed Eric may have been deliberately obtained. But the story became even more disturbing when detectives uncovered evidence suggesting that Eric may have survived an earlier poisoning attempt. According to investigators, Eric had experienced a medical emergency weeks before his death. At the time, the situation had not been fully understood. But after Eric's death and the toxicology results, detectives began reconsidering what had happened. They now suspected that Eric may have been given fentanyl on more than one occasion. The first time may not have been enough to kill him. The second time was. Meanwhile, in the months after Eric's death, Kouri Richins continued presenting herself publicly as a grieving widow. She appeared in interviews discussing the emotional challenges of losing her husband. She promoted her children's book about coping with grief. The book, titled Are You With Me?, told the story of a child learning how to deal with the loss of a father. For many people who saw those interviews, the story seemed heartbreaking. A mother was trying to help her children heal from tragedy. But behind the scenes, investigators were building a very different picture. They were gathering evidence that suggested Eric Richins' death may not have been a tragic accident. Instead, prosecutors believed it could have been a carefully planned poisoning. And the investigation was now focusing directly on the person who had been with Eric on the night he died. His wife. As detectives continued reviewing financial records, digital messages, and witness statements, the evidence against Kouri Richins began growing stronger. Eventually, investigators believed they had enough information to take the next step. More than a year after Eric Richins' death, the case would suddenly explode into national headlines. Because the grieving widow who had written a book about loss was about to face a shocking accusation. That she had murdered her own husband. More than a year after the death of Eric Richins, investigators believed they had gathered enough evidence to move forward with criminal charges. What had once appeared to be a tragic death had now become a full homicide investigation. On May 8, 2023, authorities in Utah made a dramatic move. Police arrested Kouri Richins at her home. She was charged with aggravated murder and several additional felony charges connected to the death of her husband. The arrest immediately attracted national attention. Just months earlier, Kouri had been appearing in media interviews promoting her children's book about grief. Now she was being accused of killing the very person whose death had inspired the book. For many people following the story, the situation seemed almost unbelievable. But prosecutors soon began revealing the evidence they believed connected Kouri to the crime. One of the most important pieces of evidence involved text messages investigators had discovered during the investigation. According to prosecutors, Kouri had contacted a person she knew and asked about obtaining fentanyl. The messages reportedly included conversations about purchasing the powerful opioid. Investigators believed the substance she obtained may have been used to poison Eric. But that was not the only evidence. Prosecutors also presented financial information that suggested Kouri may have had a powerful motive. According to investigators, Eric had recently discovered several financial actions taken by his wife without his knowledge. Those actions included large loans and property purchases connected to real estate projects. The financial situation had created serious tension inside the marriage. Prosecutors also revealed that Eric had recently taken steps to protect his finances. According to reports presented in court, Eric had contacted a lawyer and was considering changes to important financial arrangements. One of those changes involved a life insurance policy. Investigators later discovered that Eric had removed Kouri as the beneficiary of a policy worth several $100,000. To prosecutors, this decision may have created a major conflict. If Eric had removed her from the insurance policy and begun separating his finances, it could have threatened Kouri's access to money. But investigators soon uncovered another disturbing detail. According to prosecutors, Kouri had allegedly attempted to obtain a life insurance payout after Eric's death. But the insurance company refused the payment after reviewing the circumstances of the case. Meanwhile, detectives continued investigating how the fentanyl that killed Eric had been obtained. According to court documents, the person who had communicated with Kouri about the drug later told investigators that they had provided her with fentanyl shortly before Eric's death. This witness became a critical part of the prosecution's case. The individual told detectives that Kouri had specifically asked for the drug. For prosecutors, this testimony supported the theory that Eric's death had been planned. But the defense attorneys representing Kouri Richins quickly pushed back against these accusations. They argued that the prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence and the statements of a single witness. According to the defense, the investigation had ignored other possible explanations for Eric's death. They also questioned the reliability of the witness who claimed to have supplied the fentanyl. Despite these arguments, the charges against Kouri remained in place. During early court hearings, prosecutors described the case as a deliberate poisoning motivated by financial conflict. They argued that Kouri had secretly obtained fentanyl and used it to kill her husband. The story quickly spread across national media. Many people were stunned by the contrast between Kouri's public image and the accusations against her. Just weeks before her arrest, she had been promoting her children's book during television interviews. In those appearances, she spoke about the emotional pain of losing Eric and the challenges of raising their 3 children alone. Now those same interviews were being replayed across news broadcasts as part of the investigation. For the family and friends of Eric Richins, the accusations were devastating. Many people who had known the couple struggled to understand how the situation could have escalated to such a tragic outcome. As the legal process continued, Kouri Richins remained in custody while awaiting trial. Her attorneys continued preparing their defense, insisting that she was innocent of the charges. Meanwhile, prosecutors continued building their case. They believed the evidence would show that Eric Richins had been deliberately poisoned with fentanyl. And they believed the person responsible was the one individual who had been with him on the night he died. His wife. But the final chapter of the story had not yet been written. Because the courtroom battle that followed would determine whether the grieving widow who wrote a book about loss would ultimately be convicted of causing it. As the case against Kouri Richins continued to move through the legal system, the story remained one of the most unusual and widely discussed criminal investigations in the United States. For many people, the details of the case were difficult to understand. A grieving widow who had written a children's book about coping with loss was now accused of causing the very tragedy she had described. But in court, the focus was no longer on public appearances or media interviews. Instead, the case centered on evidence. Prosecutors believed the evidence would show that Eric Richins had been deliberately poisoned with fentanyl. They argued that the extremely high concentration of the drug in Eric's system could not have happened accidentally. Instead, they believed the fentanyl had been placed in a drink that Kouri had prepared for her husband on the night of his death. During court hearings, prosecutors also described what they believed was a pattern of suspicious behavior in the weeks before Eric died. According to investigators, Eric had experienced a medical emergency earlier that year. At the time, the incident had not been fully explained. But after Eric's death and the discovery of fentanyl in his system, detectives began suspecting that the earlier incident may have involved another poisoning attempt. Prosecutors argued that the first attempt may not have been successful. The second one was. Financial evidence also played a major role in the prosecution's theory. Investigators presented records showing that the marriage between Kouri and Eric had been under significant financial stress. Eric had reportedly discovered several real estate deals and loans that his wife had arranged without telling him. Some of those deals had created serious financial risk. Friends later said Eric had become concerned about the situation and had started taking steps to protect his finances. Prosecutors argued that these financial disputes may have created a motive. If Eric had begun separating his finances or limiting access to money, it could have threatened Kouri's real estate business and future plans. But the defense attorneys for Kouri Richins rejected the prosecution's theory. They argued that the case relied heavily on speculation. According to the defense, the investigation depended largely on the testimony of a single witness who claimed to have supplied the fentanyl. They questioned the credibility of that witness and argued that the evidence did not prove that Kouri had administered the drug. The defense also pointed out that no one had directly seen the poisoning take place. They argued that prosecutors were trying to build a story using circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof. As the legal battle continued, the case attracted national media coverage. News organizations across the country reported on the unusual details of the story. The idea that a children's book author might have murdered her husband with fentanyl captured the attention of the public. For the family of Eric Richins, however, the situation remained deeply painful. They remembered Eric as a hardworking father who cared deeply for his children. Friends described him as someone who was dedicated to his work and his family. For them, the investigation was not simply a news story. It was the search for answers about how and why Eric had died. Meanwhile, Kouri Richins remained in custody while awaiting trial. Her attorneys continued preparing their defense and maintained that she was innocent of the charges. Prosecutors, on the other hand, believed the evidence would eventually prove their case. They argued that the combination of toxicology results, financial records, witness testimony, and digital messages revealed a clear picture of what had happened. But the final outcome of the case had not yet been decided. Unlike many of the cases that had already reached a verdict, the legal process surrounding the death of Eric Richins was still unfolding. A jury would eventually examine the evidence and determine whether Kouri Richins was responsible for the death of her husband. Until that moment arrives, the case remains one of the most unsettling and mysterious criminal investigations in recent years. It is a story about trust, money, and the devastating consequences that can occur when relationships collapse under pressure. And for the 3 children left behind, it is a tragedy that will shape the rest of their lives.